I arrived to international law through European Union law. My interest in what was then called European Community law arose when I was at university. In those days, EU law was a fairly new field of expertise. Very few universities in Europe offered courses in European Union law. So there was the novelty element, and there was also an element of idealism. I always believed in the principle of European integration. So I started a career in the European Union institutions, and during my time with the European Union, I not only practiced European Union law, but also international law, because I dealt with internal policies of the European Union, but I was always interested in the relationship in between the EU order and the international order. So I worked and represented the EU with the United Nations. I prepared pieces of legislation, participated in the drafting of international conventions. So the interface in between EU law and international law was always a keen interest of mine. And the relationship in between the EU order and third countries. I did negotiations with China and the US, Canada, on issues of interest to the EU. I think that in the next few years we'll continue seeing some trends which we have witnessed in the last few decades. International law is at the intersect with a variety of issues and disciplines. Environment, science and technology, and these issues are often of a transnational nature. So if you think of the environment, climate change, if we think of science and technology, the internet, but also cybercrime and cybersecurity. So these are issues and areas which international law will have to continue facing and developing in. Another trend in the last few decades has been the important development in human rights law. And this will continue, also because human rights law faces new challenges. Trafficking of human beings is one, but also in other aspects of international crime and terrorism. Another trend which I think we've seen in the past few decades and which will continue is linked to globalization and the fact that there are many aspects of the economic of the world economy which are affected by globalization, and these are again issues which international law will have to continue addressing. I'm thinking, for instance, of certain types of international or transnational rather crime, like corruption, but again terrorism. And if we don't think of crime, there is the issue of taxation, which international law is addressing more and more. Feminist scholars have looked at international law in a different way. I'm not afraid of calling it a feminist approach, even though nowadays a gender-based approach would be perhaps a more accepted way of saying it. Feminist scholars have always been interested in women's rights and have considered them part of human rights. They've been interested in women-based in violence against women, and they've brought it to the agenda of international law. They've looked at the law on use of force in a different way, and they've looked at peaceful resolution of conflicts in a way which perhaps their male colleagues had not looked at before. So looking at also international law through a gender-based lens has been innovative and has brought a new look to a number of issues. I've been working as director of gender equality for some time in the European Commission, and formulated new policies and new legislation in the area of equality between women and men. One of the pieces of legislation that I carried through to completion, negotiating it in the Council of Ministers, was the directive on access of women to goods and services. This was a particularly difficult piece of legislation, and the opposition came from various industrial sectors, in particular the insurance sector. And this explains why the text originally foresaw an exception in insurance, life insurance. And this is something that subsequently the Court of Justice of Luxembourg deemed going against the principles of equality. But as I said, it was the result of extremely difficult negotiations in Council. Another difficult piece of legislation that I pushed through was in the area of environment. I was responsible for one of the first directives in the area of waste management and recycling of packaging material. There again, the industry was not pleased with interference, what they considered interference by the European Commission. So that was another difficult time. And then, you know, coordinating 28 ambassadors in an international organization is no mean task. I think there is a lot of goodwill everywhere, but you know, ambassadors are there to represent their country, and having a representative of the European Union speaking instead of you, it's something that they don't like. So that wasn't easy either. But these are just examples of perhaps particularly challenging files, dossiers I had. But I must say that they were difficult but extremely interesting. And I don't really think of these times as difficult times. They were challenging times, but a lot of fun as well. I've been the first ambassador to the Council of Europe, and that was an important development in the relationship in between the two organizations, the EU and the Council of Europe. I was also the first woman ambassador to to do so. At that time, there were quite a few lady ambassadors at the Council of Europe. And I suspect that there is a fair share of women ambassadors to multilateral organizations. Whether that is because foreign offices feel that representing a state in a multilateral organizations is a less powerful job than doing the same in a bilateral relations. It's a matter of opinion. Women are perhaps also better operators in a multilateral setting. But I wasn't the only woman. This is what I want to say. I had a lot of lady colleagues, very capable women representing member states in the Council of Europe. Well, things have changed a lot in international organizations, and I can perhaps talk about what I've seen in the European Commission, but the UN has been incredibly active in this area as well. When I joined the European Commission, we were only 4 women in the department that I joined, which was the Environment Protection Service. A Danish head of unit, a Scottish lawyer, a French lawyer that who left after a short while and became a judge, and myself. Now you have a fair share of professional women being recruited and making a career. So you have more women at the top, more women commissioners. In my days, when I was a young official, you had no women commissioners. The last few presidents have made sure that roughly a third of the commissioners are women. Of course, you've never had a woman president of the Commission yet, but I'm sure that will come. There was a clear policy from the Human Resource Department to try and recruit more women. And they looked, for example, at the way the exams and tests were carried out at the stage of recruitment, and certain questions which were, I wouldn't say biased, but they in a way favored men more than women. For instance, who won what football cup in what year? Those questions were eliminated. Then there was a clear policy to try and help women and men marry professional life and private life, and instructions were issued, for instance, to try and avoid holding meetings after 4:30 in the evening. Flexi time was introduced, and these are measures that can help both fathers and mothers taking care of their children or dependents. So this has changed and has helped women enormously in European Union or institutions, and indeed in other international organizations. I'm all in favor of quotas, and I consider them positive discrimination. I mean, they basically address issues of injustice and discrimination, and they try to reach a position, a situation of equality. Once that is reached, then you no longer need quotas. But I think that in certain circumstances, they're really necessary to give a boost to minorities, whether we're talking about ethnic minorities or gender, it doesn't matter. I think quotas are a good thing. I think that both organizations are good employers. They're good not only for women but also for men. I mean, men can take parental leave. I've had male colleagues taking Wednesday afternoons off to look after their children. So I think it's important that we look at these measures as family-friendly measures, not women-friendly measures. Yeah, I think that the European institutions are a good workplace for men and women alike. Well, one thing that worries me is the fact that perhaps what used to be called the feminist agenda is fading. I have the feeling, rightly or wrongly, that gender issues perhaps are more a concern for women of my age than for young women, and that perhaps the feminist spirit of the 60s and 70s is no longer there. And we need young women to be conscious of the fact that even though legislation has changed in a very significant way in the last 50 years, these equalities still exist, and they exist in society, on the workplace. Just one example, the gender pay gap. How many women, young women, realize that they are systematically discriminated that way? The international law is a very broad and diversified field of study and expertise. My only advice would be do it, join it. It's a competitive field, but it's also an area in which you need to bring a certain amount of idealism. And my other piece of advice would be always bring a feminist agenda to it.